Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. New York, JFK Airport, a clear spring morning. James Carter, 32, black, elegant, with a proud but calm expression, walked through the terminal toward his boarding gate. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and polished black leather shoes. His appearance reflected success, a graduate of a prestigious university, an executive at an innovative technology company, respected by his colleagues, admired by his friends. James was used to stares, sometimes curious, sometimes envious, but he had learned to remain impassive. That day, he was preparing to board a flight to Los Angeles to give an important conference on artificial intelligence. He was focused, his thoughts focused on his presentation and the professional meetings he would have. The atmosphere of the airport was familiar, the hum of announcements, the coming and going of passengers, the clatter of suitcases on the marble floor. But this apparent calm would soon be shattered. On board the plane, flight attendant Emily Watson, 28, blonde, with a stern face and sharp gaze, was already on duty. Among her colleagues, she was known for her arrogance and difficult personality. Some described her as a perfectionist, others as intolerant and impulsive. She had a way of eyeing passengers with suspicion, of judging in an instant without knowing a single shred of their story. When her eyes fell on James, something changed. He was polite, calm, smiling, the exact opposite of what Emily seemed to tolerate. For no reason, a feeling of racial superiority washed over her. What followed would mark James's life and shock all who witnessed it. This flight, supposed to be routine, would turn into a scene of injustice and humiliation, but also a lesson in dignity and courage. For in the air above New York, James would discover that patience and dignity can be more powerful weapons than anger. The plane had just finished boarding. James Carter, his carry-on suitcase stowed in the overhead compartment, settled into his aisle seat, ready for a flight that was expected to last 6 hours. He pulled out his laptop and began reviewing his presentation notes. At that moment, Emily Watson walked past him, her quick, nervous stride already betraying her impatience. Arriving at James's row, she stared at her ticket and frowned. "Sir," she said, her voice cold. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" James looked up from his computer, polite but slightly surprised by the aggression in his tone. "Yes, ma'am. I'm in seat 14A, as indicated on my ticket." Emily looked at him, her eyes narrowing behind her perfect makeup. She shook her head as if to say, not convinced. I thought, no, it must be a mistake." James sighed softly, trying to defuse the tension. "I assure you, everything is in order. I can show you my ticket again if you wish." But Emily, irritated by his calmness, did not answer. She took a step forward and, suddenly, with an impulsive and violent gesture, raised her hand and slapped him on the cheek. The shock was instantaneous. James felt the burning pain on his cheek and froze, his eyes wide. The noise echoed through the cabin. The stunned passengers stopped their conversations. A palpable tension set in, as if time had stood still. "What the?" whispered a passenger sitting next to him, shocked. James remained calm, but his hands were shaking slightly. He took a deep breath, knowing that retaliating physically would only make the situation worse. "Madam, why?" he asked with dignity, his voice firm but controlled. Emily looked at him with a mixture of contempt and anger. "You dare talk to me like that?" she yelled, ignoring the shocked looks around them. At that point, some passengers stood up to defend him. A woman in her 30s, Sarah Mitchell, took out her phone and began filming the incident. "What you're doing is unacceptable," shouted a man in the opposite row. "You can't hit a passenger for no reason." Emily, unsettled by the reactions around her, stepped back slightly, but her face still expressed anger and superiority. James, for his part, remained standing in his seat, straight and calm, his eyes fixed on her, not with hatred, but with the dignity of someone who refuses to give in to injustice. The captain, alerted by the noise, arrived in the aisle and asked firmly, "What's going on here?" Emily stammered, searching for ridiculous excuses, while the passengers murmured among themselves, shocked and angry. The tone was set. This flight, which should have been ordinary, had just become a scene of injustice, and James Carter was going to have to face more than just the discomfort of air travel. The cabin, silent just seconds earlier, was now filled with an anxious murmur. The passengers' gazes focused alternately on James and Emily. Many were shocked, some murmured among themselves, and others shook their heads in disbelief. Sarah Mitchell, sitting 2 rows behind James, immediately raised her phone and started filming. "It's going on social media," she whispered quietly, aware of the gravity of the situation. A white businessman, John Reynolds, stepped into the aisle. "Hostess! What are you doing? This is unacceptable," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. Emily took a few steps back, her jaw clenched. He. I don't know." She stammered, unable to formulate a valid excuse. Her anger was making her incoherent. James, remaining calm, spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. I'm not looking for confrontation. I just want this to be settled fairly." An older woman, Martha Green, in the row opposite, shook her head. "Justice? You deserve much more than that, young man. What she did is unacceptable." The unrest grew. Some passengers began calling the flight attendants to demand that Emily be detained until the captain intervened. The murmur became a chorus of protest. The captain, a man in his 50s named Robert Hastings, stepped forward quickly. His strong, authoritative voice cut through the commotion. "Miss Watson, please calm down and apologize immediately." Emily crossed her arms and shook her head. "That passenger provoked me," she exclaimed, forgetting that her slap had been entirely unjustified. James, in a firm but calm voice, replied. "I didn't provoke you in any way. I've been sitting here calmly from the beginning. Your actions are unjustifiable." The captain sighed and turned to the passengers. "I understand this is shocking. We will manage this. No one should stand up or physically intervene. We will continue the procedure and file a report upon landing." But the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers, shocked by the stewardess's violence and apparent racism, began to chat among themselves, some expressing solidarity with James. Sarah Mitchell continued filming, knowing that this video could have a national impact. James, aware that the situation could escalate, kept his head high and his shoulders straight, a paragon of calm and dignity. His eyes met those of the passengers who silently supported him. This simple gesture showed that despite the injustice, he would not give in to fear or anger. At that precise moment, James realized that this flight wasn't just a journey between New York and Los Angeles. It had become a site of confrontation, a stage where courage and dignity could challenge racism and injustice. And something told him that this moment would change his life, and the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The heavy silence in the cabin was soon broken by the captain, Robert Hastings. His stern face and authoritative tone imposed calm. "Miss Watson, I order you to apologize immediately to this passenger for your actions," he declared. Emily Watson looked at him, her eyes blazing with anger and defiance. "I did nothing wrong," she retorted, her voice trembling but full of confidence. "That passenger provoked me." She paused, realizing that all the passengers were watching her. James, still calm, replied in a calm but firm voice. "Madam, I have never behaved aggressively or disrespectfully towards you. I have been sitting here quietly the whole time. Your actions are unjustifiable." A murmur of support rose through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged shocked glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The flight attendant's hostility now seemed to isolate Emily from everyone. Sarah Mitchell, still filming, whispered to her neighbor. "She really thinks she can get away with denying everything. This video will change everything." Emily, unable to verbally retort in the face of James's dignity, turned away for a moment to hide her frustration. Then, returning to him, she attempted one last pathetic justification. He had an air, that made me uncomfortable." James took a deep breath, controlling his inner anger. Being uncomfortable never excuses violence. You hit a man for no reason. This is not acceptable, here or anywhere else. The captain spoke again, his firm voice echoing through the cabin. "Stop all attempts to justify yourself. Your behavior is unacceptable and will be reported to the authorities upon landing." Emily crossed her arms, visibly furious, but no impulsive gestures followed. The rest of the flight promised to be tense. The passengers, shocked by this scene, exchanged glances and whispers, some in support of James, others angry at the flight attendant's racist and aggressive attitude. James, despite the slap, remained motionless, dignified, head held high, aware that every act of calm and self-control was a small victory over injustice. He understood that the real battle was not being played out in the physical moment, but in how he would respond to this humiliation. At that moment, one thing became clear to him: this flight would not remain anonymous, and the whole world would have to see what had just happened. As the plane broke through the clouds above New York City, Sarah Mitchell, still seated 2 rows behind James, finished filming the incident on her phone. Her hand was shaking slightly, but her spirit was determined. She knew this video could have a huge impact. "James, I'm going to post this now," she whispered. "People need to see what just happened." James nodded, looking at her gratefully. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't want revenge, just for the world to know the truth." A few minutes later, the video was uploaded to Twitter and Instagram, along with the text. "Unbelievable incident on JFK LA flight, Black passenger slapped for no reason by flight attendant. #Justice for James #racism in flight." The first reactions quickly appeared. Shares multiplied, comments poured in, indignation, anger, support. In less than an hour, the video had already been viewed by thousands of people. Passengers around James stared at their phones, some moved, others furious. An atmosphere of unity and solidarity spontaneously formed. Messages of support began to reach James, reminding him that he was not alone in this injustice. At the same time, national media outlets became aware of the incident. Journalists called the airline for comment, and some news networks began preparing reports on what had just happened on board. Emily Watson, for her part, found herself increasingly isolated. The tension on board had reached a critical point. The passengers were watching her, some openly displaying their contempt. Her face, once full of confidence and superiority, now tensed under the pressure of the collective gaze. The captain, aware of the potential virality of the situation, decided to reinforce discipline. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We will manage this situation upon landing. No physical intervention is permitted." James, always dignified and calm, understood that this moment would become a turning point in his life. What had started as an ordinary flight had turned into an event that would shake the airline, raise public awareness, and expose the latent racism in the skies. As the plane continued its route to Los Angeles, James felt a mixture of emotions: anger at the injustice, pride in his calm, and a newfound determination. He knew the real battle was only just beginning. Upon landing in Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. Passengers murmured among themselves, some still discussing the incident. Sarah Mitchell, still next to James, showed her phone. The video had already been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Soon after, airline officials received the information. The New York and Los Angeles offices were in turmoil. Management, aware of the gravity of the situation, called an emergency meeting. "We have a major reputational problem," Communications Director Mark Lawson told the council. "The video is viral, and social media is going viral. If we don't respond quickly, it could damage our image for years to come." The company's CEO, Caroline Benson, an experienced businesswoman, frowned. "What do we know about the hostess involved?" she asked. "Her name is Emily Watson," Lawson replied. "She has been known for difficult behavior in the past, but nothing of this magnitude. We need to act immediately." A few hours later, the company published an official statement. "We strongly condemn any unacceptable behavior by our staff. An internal investigation has been launched and the flight attendant involved has been suspended immediately. We are working to ensure this type of incident never happens again. On board the plane, James and Sarah read the statement on their phones. James took a deep breath. "This is just a start," he said quietly. "But at least they're aware there's a problem." Emily, now suspended and aware of the magnitude of the case, felt trapped. Her usual anger and arrogance gave way to genuine concern. The passengers had testified, the video was circulating, and her reputation had just collapsed in a matter of hours. National media outlets began contacting James for his testimony. Television stations, radio stations, and newspapers wanted to understand the incident and interview the man who had maintained his dignity in the face of injustice. For James, the situation was no longer merely personal. It had taken on a national dimension. He realized that his calm and measured response could become a symbol, an example of courage in the face of racism and the abuse of power. As day fell over Los Angeles, James stood outside the airport, reflecting on what had just happened. One thing was certain, this slap, though violent and unjust, would trigger something much bigger. The fight for justice and dignity had just begun. The next morning, James Carter woke up in his Los Angeles hotel to find his phone buzzing non-stop. Notifications were pouring in at a frantic pace: calls, messages, emails, social media alerts. The video of the incident had gone viral. Thousands of people expressed their solidarity and anger at the injustice. Sarah Mitchell, still at his side, watched the reaction live. "James, look at this," she said, pointing at the screen. Celebrities, journalists, civil rights lawyers, and anti-discrimination groups had begun sharing the video and posting messages of support. "James Carter, you are an example of dignity in the face of injustice. Your calm inspires the country. We support your right to justice and condemn racism in all its forms." The messages were multiplying. National television reports began to recount the story, citing James's name and details of the incident. The airline, aware of the mounting media pressure, had already launched an internal investigation and suspended Emily Watson, but that was no longer enough. James, despite the media uproar, remained true to his nature, calm, thoughtful, and dignified. "I'm not seeking revenge," he said in an early telephone interview. "I want this kind of behavior to stop. No one should be shamed for the color of their skin." Civil rights groups immediately offered their support. They contacted James to offer legal advice and help him prepare a lawsuit against the flight attendant and the airline, if necessary. Among them, the National Civil Rights Alliance, NCRA, was particularly proactive. Across the country, citizens began to express their outrage on social media, organizing campaigns in support of James. Symbolic protests took place outside the airline's offices in several major cities, all peaceful but determined to denounce racism and abuse of power. James gradually realized that he had become, in spite of himself, a national symbol. His calm, dignity, and self-control in the face of unjust aggression inspired thousands of people. He understood that his voice could now be used for something greater, to change perceptions and behaviors, and to push justice to act. As he watched the messages of support scroll through his phone, James felt a deep emotion, gratitude to those who had defended him and a strengthened resolve. What Emily Watson had tried to destroy, his dignity, had now become a rallying point for thousands of people. The fight for justice had reached a new level, and James knew he was no longer alone. The entire nation was now witnessing this injustice, and nothing could remain hidden. A few days after the incident, James Carter stood in the Los Angeles office of the National Civil Rights Alliance, NCRA. The air was thick with seriousness and concentration. Before him, a team of civil rights lawyers, led by senior attorney Angela Thompson, was reviewing evidence and preparing a legal strategy. "James," Angela began, her voice calm but firm, "we have the video, the passengers' testimonies, and even the captain's statement. You have a strong case. But what's most important is your testimony. Your calm and dignity are incredible strengths." James nodded, his jaw clenched but his gaze determined. "I'm not seeking to humiliate Emily or seek revenge. I just want justice to be served, and for this kind of behavior to never happen again. The legal team explained that the claim would address physical assault, overt racism, and emotional distress caused by the incident. But they also emphasized the symbolic impact. This trial could become a national message against racism in transport and public spaces. The day of the filing arrived. James walked into the Los Angeles federal courthouse with quiet dignity. Reporters were already there, cameras and microphones focused on him. Emily Watson, accompanied by her lawyer, was waiting for him, visibly nervous. When he took the stand to testify, James remained calm and articulate. Every word he spoke reflected not anger, but resilience. I sit here today not for revenge, but to defend my dignity and that of all those who, like me, might one day be victims of injustice. This slap, this violent and racist act, should never have happened. And I want to make sure that no one suffers the same humiliation. Witness passengers were also present, confirming James's story and describing the assault with emotion. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who filmed the incident, explained how she decided to publish the video so the world could see the truth. Emily, forced to confront the irrefutable evidence and testimony, seemed increasingly fragile. Her defenses, based on anxiety or supposed provocation, dissolved in the face of the clarity and dignity of James's account. As the hearing continued, James felt a new sense of dignity wash over him, the power of his own dignity. He had transformed humiliation into strength. Every look from the passengers, every word from the witnesses, and every expression of support from across the country reinforced his conviction. As he left the courtroom, reporters crowded around him. James, with the same humility and calm he had displayed in the airplane cabin, said, "Justice is not just an individual right. It is a message for everyone. We must show that dignity and respect are never negotiable." The nation was now watching his journey closely. James Carter's story was no longer that of a slapped passenger, but of a man who had transformed an unjust humiliation into a symbol of courage and dignity. A few weeks into the trial, Emily Watson found herself increasingly isolated. Social media continued to share the video, national media outlets reported on every development, and her name was now publicly associated with an act of racism and violence. Her colleagues avoided all contact. Work calls were rare. Even her close friends, previously proud of her work, began to distance themselves, embarrassed by the scale of the scandal. Emily felt for the first time what it meant to be alone with the consequences of her actions. The court resumed its hearings. Video evidence and passenger testimony made her defense increasingly fragile. Emily's lawyer tried to justify her actions by claiming stress and misinterpreting James's behavior, but the judge, implacable, shook her head at every argument. "This is not a matter of personal perception," the judge said. "This is an unprovoked act of violence against a passenger. The color of his skin cannot be a justification." Emily, who had long believed that her position and her uniform would protect her, realized that the reality was different. Every word spoken in the room, every testimony published in the media, every comment on social media stood as a cruel reminder of her actions. At home, Emily stared at her phone, notifications flooding her. Messages of condemnation and public scorn were piling up. Her professional image was now permanently tarnished. The job offers she'd hoped to receive after her suspension were rescinded. Her career, patiently built, had just collapsed in a matter of days. Even her family, shocked by the viral nature of the incident, struggled to understand her actions. They felt cornered, helpless, and alone in the face of the media storm. For the first time, Emily understood the gravity of her actions. She had not only humiliated James Carter, but she had triggered a national backlash that would leave her no escape. Meanwhile, James, ever dignified and focused on justice, observed the consequences without hatred. Emily's fall was the direct result of his actions, but for him, it was not a personal victory, it was justice being done. Emily Watson had lost more than just a job. She had lost the public's trust, the reputation she thought was inviolable, and the confidence that she could ever undo the harm she had caused. Her fall became a symbol of accountability. In a society where justice and dignity are upheld, no abuse goes unpunished. The James Carter trial was now reaching national proportions. Each hearing was broadcast live or covered by hundreds of journalists. Television, radio, and online media commented on every detail of the case. The public followed with fascination and emotion the unfolding of this story, a symbol of the fight against racism and the abuse of power. In one of the most high-profile hearings, James took the stand in court, this time with a large audience in the room and cameras focused on him. "What happened that day," he began, "is not an isolated case. It is an illustration of what many people experience daily, being judged, humiliated, or attacked simply because of the color of their skin." Reporters took note of every word, and viewers across the country were gripped by his testimony. Passenger testimonies poured in, each describing Emily's slap and James's undiminished dignity in the face of violence. Civil rights groups, invited to speak, took advantage of the national attention to remind everyone that vigilance and solidarity are necessary to protect the dignity of each individual. The case became a topic of debate in schools, businesses, and public institutions. Airlines, affected by the media coverage and public outrage, announced mandatory training programs on diversity and passenger respect. Conferences and workshops were held to raise awareness among staff about combating racism and abuse of power. James, meanwhile, became a symbol of courage and dignity. The media hailed him as a model of peaceful resistance and a national voice for justice. But James remained humble. In an interview, he said, "I am not a hero. I simply chose not to give in to anger and hatred. It is this choice that can inspire change." The public lesson was clear: in the face of injustice, dignity and courage overcome violence and hatred. James's story showed that patience and self-control could transform an act of humiliation into a powerful message of justice and national solidarity. Emily Watson, meanwhile, watched the trial from home, slowly realizing that her career was irreparably damaged and her reputation would be forever tarnished. Society as a whole had just reminded her that her actions had tangible and visible consequences. At the end of the hearing, James left the courtroom to the applause and encouragement of passers-by and journalists present. He realized that this battle for justice was not just personal, it affected an entire society and sent a universal message: no injustice, racial or otherwise, would go unchallenged. A few weeks after the trial ended, James Carter stood again in the Los Angeles airport, this time on a private flight that would take him to a civil rights conference. But the atmosphere was different. The looks of passengers and employees now reflected respect and admiration, no longer suspicion or prejudice. The airline issued an official statement. "We sincerely apologize to James Carter for the incident that occurred on board our flight. We strongly condemn any act of violence or discrimination. Strict measures have been taken to ensure this never happens again." Emily Watson, permanently suspended and confronted with the extent of her fall, was no longer in the news. Her name was now associated with a lesson in responsibility and justice, an example of what happens to anyone who lets hate dictate their actions. James, for his part, had become a national symbol. Schools, businesses, and organizations now used his story to teach respect, patience, and dignity in the face of injustice. He received letters of thanks from citizens, young students, and even public figures, praising his courage and self-control. At a major conference in Los Angeles, before hundreds of attendees and media, James said, "What I experienced is not unique. Many suffer humiliation every day. But I want to show that dignity and self-respect are powerful weapons. Justice can be achieved not through violence, but through perseverance, courage, and solidarity." The room erupted in applause. James's words resonated beyond the room, they touched an entire country, reminding us that every individual act of courage can inspire collective transformation. Sarah Mitchell, who had filmed the incident and posted the video, stood by his side. "Without you, it would never have had this impact," she whispered to him. James smiled at her, humble but grateful. Looking out at the horizon, James recalled that moment on the plane, when an unjust slap had tried to break him. He realized that slap had instead been the catalyst for something greater, a universal message of justice and dignity. The world had witnessed injustice, and through his calm and inner strength, James Carter had transformed humiliation into moral victory. He had proven that true strength lies in dignity and courage in the face of adversity. And as the sun set over Los Angeles, illuminating the horizon in golden hues, James stood tall, calm and determined, a man who had faced injustice, and emerged stronger, more respected and freer than ever.